Graze 300 talk here today. It's the feature subject of Grazing Math, and I'm Carl Stafford, Senior Extension Agent, Livestock Forages. It's important to reflect back that this Graze 300 has been going on in Virginia since 2005, and here in the last 5 years, there's been a adoption of this branded program across the state, and a big push this year in reaching out to those who serve farmers and helping them figure out ways that they can adopt some of the grazing practices. This Grazing Math is the bottom line of the whole deal, and Grazing Math gets at a lot of the important factors that make grazing in the wintertime successful. So let's start with the number one feature there, and that is stocking rate. The stocking rate has to do with acres allocated per unit of animal, whether it's an animal unit, whether it's a cow and calf pair. Stocking rate is an important consideration. Taking inventory of our stockpile feed and our hay in our barn. Stockpiling can be measured. It can be measured with precise instruments. It can be measured with your eyes. It's an important piece of knowledge to know how far you can get into the winter time with your feed supply. Another indicator of how far that feed supply will last is what the dry matter intake is, what the requirement is of those animals that are out there. And if you've got higher requirement than you expect, then the dry matter is not going to go as far as you anticipate. Dry matter intake is a part of animal science and nutrition, and it's a very exact science, but when it's applied, it becomes inexact. Utilization in the wintertime is the main focus of this part and section. So winter is the most important. It's when we don't get any regrowth. It's when we need that stockpile feed the most. It's when we are going to have the opportunity to make the most money. If I were to have livestock at one time a year, it would be in the wintertime, because I can graze them in the winter, and that's when most of the cost is experienced in a cow-calf system. Net income is the bottom line. It's something that helps us indicate how we're doing economically. It must include depreciation both of livestock, of our cows, and of our equipment. We also need to consider land and labor in our net income calculations. Production per acre is something that we don't always consider. It is something that crop farmers consider, hay farmers consider. It's livestock production per acre is a fact of Europeans' view of economics. They want to know how profitable that land acre is. They want to know if one piece of land is more productive than another, and they apply values according to that. Soil fertility is another thing we're going to talk about. It's a factor of cost. It's a factor of production, and it's an important feature. So this image here today is offered as a analyzing kind of thing. Is this a high stocking rate? Well, it looks like it might not be, but if all the grass that they've got is what they're standing on, it's a pretty high stocking rate. So pounds of animal per unit of land is pretty high right there. I would ask you to consider acres per animal unit, or acres per head, or acres per cow and calf pair. And in the pair example, I like to use 3 acres per cow and calf pair as a way to get started, a way to make it simple, a way to give extra land to the production system and avoid being caught in a corner, being caught short. Our goal will be to graze into the winter. Often we, in high hay feeding situations, we're done grazing by Thanksgiving, and we're feeding from then on until about Easter. If we can get on into January with our grazing, then we've stretched out those economical days of maintenance. We've stretched out, we've shortened the time in which we have to utilize that expensive hay. So grazing into winter would be an objective or goal to try and impact the bottom line. So we know an animal unit is 1,000 pounds. And so all animal units are created equal. It's an even playing field. So in a cow and calf pair example, I like to use the fact that a cow and calf pair is 2 animal units, and you would argue with me there because the calf is small, but he also gets big. And so if we assume a cow is 13 and a calf is 7, that's 2,000, kind of easy, quick math. And that's 2 animal units. So we're hedging, we're being careful by counting that calf heavy in the beginning of the growing season, but as it gets bigger, it's utilizing more and more of its dry matter requirement and has more load on the system. So start being careful with the high expectation of animal units in the beginning gives you room later on. And I think that's a way to be careful. So we don't often, everyone doesn't have scales. So going high on our expectations of requirement, be conservative. So I think that's what that means. Having an inventory. So that fallen plate meter is shown there. Ed Rayburn in West Virginia is the designer of that thing. It's calibrated according to his design. Bobby Clark is the constructor of it. He's made these things. He's made them available to across to those that need it. So that's his plate meter there. We've put the logo on it, and we're using that to help you get a handle on how much stockpile you've got, what the tonnage is out there on the land. So inches under that plate meter will be taller when there's a lot of grass. It'll support the weight of that plate meter across the given square inches, and it'll stand up taller when there's more grass under it. That's very direct and commonsensical. And Rayburn designed this thing to behave as such. You put a yardstick through it. You suspend the yardstick on the plate meter on the yardstick. You drop it down. You lower it down onto the grass and cite what the inches are. Convert those inches to tons per acre, and now you're beginning to get a handle on stockpile inventory. You're beginning to get comfortable about how much you've got, and convert that to with the utilization rate, knowing that you might have a ton, but you're not going to use that whole ton. So you count that at 80% to be 1,800 pounds. So you don't get to use it all just because you measured it all. Issues out there would include footing. Probably the number one problem with winter grazing would be wet fields, and your utilization rate's going to plummet maybe by 2/3 when the ground gets wet. So being cautious, being under optimistic, that'll help you. Another thing that's a variable with the plate meter is land variation. So not every square foot of grass is created equal. And for those square feet that you measure, they're assumed to be representative of the field, and maybe they are not always. So dry matter requirement, it's needed based on the stage of production of the animal. It's needed based on the size of the animal. We can project high at 3% of body weight, and that'll keep us out of trouble rather than using 2.5%. That's a typical recommendation. If you go with 3, that'll give you some cushion. Weather changes that intake, that dry matter requirement, stage of production. And this nutrition business is pretty exact on paper, but in application, it's inexact. So if you're one that is very exacting of your system, you're going to need to put on your flexibility britches and figure out a way to flow with it. You can have a road map, but you need to be willing to go down a side road if that's the only way forward. Net income is about counting costs. So in the efficiency world, the big producers have kind of hold all the cards. They're hard to compete with. They buy and sell in volume. They've got every advantage. They buy direct, they sell direct. Small producers buy retail. Big producers buy wholesale. So the only way a small producer can compete is when they control their biggest costs. This is DeVetter at Kansas State saying this. He compared the big boys to the small ones. He found that when the small ones controlled that winter feed costs, they were competitive with the big producers. So here in Virginia, there's a lot of small producers. In fact, they produce most of the feeder cattle. So the way for them to go forward and compete is to control winter feed cost. And that cost should include cow and equipment depreciation. We've got that cow, we need to depreciate her over her useful life. It's a cost we have to recoup. Same with the equipment. We have to pay for that equipment eventually. And then we need we have land and labor costs. Land is easy to get at. It's just a matter of what the going rental rate is. And when you charge yourself for your land, you're being true to the market value of the land that could be rented out. Labor is the same way. You might be worth $50 an hour, but you're only going to charge your system, maybe 10 to 20 bucks for somebody that could do what you're doing in terms of moving cattle and fixing fence and bush hogging land. That would be a laborer's kind of rate, not a manager's sort of rate. And then we need to get at what our cow cost is. So I carry that number around in my head all the time. Why? Because I'm watching the feeder cattle market, trying to understand if there is a net revenue going on, a net income. And when I see calves that are grossing $800, I know that we're about at the high end of the break even on cow costs. And so when they get on up into the $800s and $900, now I'm looking at a profit per calf. So I'm always figuring that calculation. That's easiest for me. That's how I look at numbers. And I challenge you to figure out what your cow cost is. Production per unit of land is a way that crop and hay farmers look at it. It's a way that Europeans look at it. Dairy folks have kind of driven this mindset. They get daily feedback from a dairy system. They see that pounds are increasing. They did something to make that increase. They keep on doing it. So they're constantly getting corrections from their management, and they follow the ones that are advantageous. In the beef industry, though, we don't get any daily feedback. We get annual feedback. So that feedback is pounds of calf per acre. Here's an example where those pounds were actually really measured. Calves went to market and they were weighed. They were across 67 acres along with the cows. That ended up being 190 pounds per acre times the market rate at the time. It came out to some $260 per acre. So these were for gross revenue on wean vaccinated calves per acre. And the challenge is, what was the cost? Did we spend that much getting that money? And if we had less spending per acre, then we're showing a net return. Of course, so soil fertility, and this is the last slide. And I show the two individuals there in a trial, a piece of land that I rented. Actually, they were looking at trying to measure two different factors. One was nitrogen application. One was a cutting system difference. So let's look at what that hay is a removal management. And we remove nutrients from that hay land, and then we take those nutrients over onto the pasture, or we export those nutrients off the farm to the next place where the hay is fed. So we generally don't feed hay on hay land. And so we're always exporting nutrients. We've got to replace those nutrients. Pasture, on the other hand, doesn't remove much. Cattle are real inefficient. When they take in their diet, they tend to put most of it back in urine and manure. So they're only about 10% efficient. And so pastures tend to hold their soil fertility over time compared to hay. Distribution is the big issue with pasture. If it's a controlled grazing system and you decide where the animal's grazing for how long, then the nutrients tend to go back where they were harvested from. The issue we can't control is shade. We tend to have shade where it is, and we can't move the shade. Some have tried to move portable shade. It might work for you. I don't find that it works for me, but that's the drawback of shade. Nutrients tend to accumulate there. Stockpile nitrogen has historically been, we typically have applied nitrogen to generate stockpile, and that's at the rate of 60 to 80 pounds per acre. Do we need to do it? There's some information that says possibly we won't have to, particularly where we have an old sod. So old sods have organic matter that's decaying. That decay releases nitrogen and carbon dioxide. And we get the background yields of some 2,500 pounds in several examples. And that's from the nitrogen cycle in the soil. And we don't get enough extra yield from nitrogen applied to pay for that nitrogen at current prices compared to the feed that it generates at hay values that are found to be available. So an old sod releases nitrogen. It also respires carbon, and we can measure that with a CO2 test. Fringe louvers, look him up. So in conclusion, we stop for economic optimum. We need to measure our feed resource. We need to count costs. We need to estimate higher. We need to pray for rain. We need to know our revenue per acre, know our cow costs, manage grazing, conserve nutrients on pasture. It doesn't require annual inputs, and nitrogen may not be needed to create stockpile.